Welcome to Ecology, the podcast dedicated to interesting people doing interesting things in internal communications. And we're back this episode to talk about if employees are even remotely interested in employee communications with Ginny Field, Director of Redefining Communications, and Benjamin Ellis, CEO at Social Optic. If internal comms is your passion, then this is your podcast. Listen in. I'm your host, Chuck Ghost. Thanks for listening. In June, I got to see Ginny Field present at IEBC World Conference about research that she and Benjamin conducted around the topic of remote employees and employee communication. But before we get into that, let's learn a little bit more about each of them. But first off, Ginny and Benjamin, welcome to the show.
Hi, great. Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
Ginny, as previously mentioned, you're the Director of Redefining Communication. What should people know about you and Redefining Communications?
So one of the things people should probably know about me is that I tend to speak my mind quite a lot and I'm quite blunt. One of the things you should know about Redefining Communications is that we launched the business a couple of years ago, really designed to try and take the chaos out of organizations and bring a sense of calm, really, just through better communication across the workplace.
Perfect. And with you, Benjamin, you're the CEO of Social Optic. What should we know about you?
So passionate about data, passionate about people. I think that people are the most valuable asset that any business has, but also that actually you need to evidence what you're doing with real hard data to understand what the best ways to improve the environment are.
And what is your background? Where did this love of data come from?
So I kind of have an unusual background. So I started off in an engineering background and kind of computing and network engineering. So kind of very data driven, very how things relate to each other. And then around about 10 years ago now, went back to college, went back to university, did a psychology degree and studied organizational psychology. So my day job is kind of bringing those both together. Also with technology and particularly data science, now we can collect data in a much more cost-effective way and get insights and understanding out of that in ways that we couldn't do even just a few years ago. And that really is that intersection of kind of engineering and technology and actually understanding the context of the psychology of what's going on.
And Jenny, there's been a lot of talks, debates, conversations, whatever you want to call it, around remote workers, employee communication, connecting them to the business. Where did this research come from? And was it a curiosity itch you needed to scratch, or was there much more to it than that?
So a little bit more to it than that. I attended the Gatehouse State of the Sector launch, which was a couple of years ago. That's their annual survey into the state of the internal comm sector. And they always show the barriers that internal communicators are facing. And one of those barriers was communicating to a remote workforce. And I've worked in communications for 15 years, and I'm pretty sure that's been a barrier for about 15 years. And what frustrated me was that the things people were focusing on weren't aligned to the barriers. So I decided, after looking at that research, that really we needed to look at why they were a barrier and then how do we overcome that, but also looking at the channels that they cover in their research, but looking at that aligned to some content as well. So it was a bit of a curiosity thing, but it's also out of a frustration that, we need to move things forward. Otherwise, we're just going to get stuck with the same barriers year on year.
And I'm a fan of the Gatehouse State of the Sector survey that comes out every year, but it is from the communicator's perspective, whereas yours was more from the employee perspective, which I think was a much needed shift on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was the point for me, was you only get a certain perspective when you're talking to communicators. It's similarly, if you go to a conference, you're hearing from the communicator, not from the audience. And I think it's much more powerful to hear directly from them.
And Benjamin, how did you two get together in this project and blend your talents? You talked about your variety of your background and Jenny with her comms leadership. How did you guys get together and start working on this research?
So we've kind of worked together in different domains over many years, but this particular piece came out from from my perspective, we're very much in the digital domain and lots of organizations are making that transition. And it's really important to be inclusive in that and kind of take everyone on the journey. Particularly that voice of the remote workers often doesn't get as heard, and particularly those folks who are more offline. So it's really an opportunity to take our kind of data analysis expertise and attitude collection, and combine that with that understanding that Jenny has around the comms environment and what's going off there, and contextualize that. So it's a really good fit on an area we were both very interested in and passionate about, and combining our expertise on the data side and the context around communications, and then the umbrella of what does that mean for a business strategically, and how they can take things forward and do a better job.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the old peanut butter or Reese cup commercials where it was like, we got the chocolate and the peanut butter, and then they put them together, and it's like, why did we never think of this before? But Jenny, in comms, we use a lot of confusing terms. What I mean to that is, one thing at one company, employee engagement at one company is not employee engagement at another company. And you guys are talking about remote workers, and I think that kind of fits into this. So define in this research how you're describing, or what do you mean by the use of the word remote workers?
You're so right. We've had a few people think that when we're talking about remote workers, we're talking about people that maybe work in an office in America and an office in the UK, and how do you get those people to connect? And that wasn't the group we looked at for this. So we also refer to them as a deskless worker. So these are people that are driving trains, serving coffee, working on manufacturing lines, fire service, people like that have very limited access to digital tools and are to me truly remote from the organization.
Yeah, I think that's something I still struggle with, because some people will use the term deskless worker, which I don't know why we're defining that by a piece of furniture. You'll hear people that disconnected, which has different connotations to it. Then you've got knowledge workers, which implies that some superiority to it. So I think that is a struggle. So thanks for defining what you guys mean by that. And then Benjamin, to your side, talk a little bit about how the data was collected and analyzed, because I think that's a challenge that a lot of communicators have, is they might be getting data, but they don't know how to begin building a story around that data.
Exactly, and it is exactly that. It's getting the data to tell you a story. So there's two parts to that. One is around the data collection, which is it's kind of a very cold term, but our platform is designed to give people an online survey experience, but it's designed to be very quick to use, because again, it wants to be attractive, but these folks are really time scarce is kind of one of the things that we picked up. So they could pick up an iPad or could do it on a phone, and they just tapped a few buttons on kind of what hit home with them. It's like, yeah, that's important. Okay, that's true. That's not true. So a question set that was designed so they didn't have to think too much and could really kind of get their opinions into the system quickly. So that gets us the raw data. And then using data science and data engineering to really present that data in different ways, because the way to get the value out of data is not to present summaries of it. And so often, for example, with employee engagement surveys, people like put up a score. It's like, it's a 95 rather than 96. Well, there's no insight in that. It's actually being able to come to the data with questions and say, well, we think this. Does the data support that, or does it disagree with this? And so really Survey Optic is designed so that the communicator can look at it and say, is this thing I believe true or not? Does the data tell me something different? But also you can get the data to kind of shake out some stories. So we present the data in a visual way. We go, well, that really kind of stands out. Kind of interesting, but not important. Why is that? Or important, but not useful. And you start to get insights by looking at the data that way, that people really value their colleagues, but that actually might not be an information source they trust as authoritative, even though they spend a lot of time with that. In environments where people work remotely from their manager versus ones where they're working side by side with them, actually in both of those environments, the manager has the same level of impact. So getting those kind of insights out of the data is kind of what we specialize in helping folks do, by kind of helping them lead the data into their context and get some actual insights out of it.
And how did you go about, we go back to the very first point around the questions you created for those employees. On the research side, I know it's very tough to take your own bias and thinking out of the question. So how long did it take to even develop that initial question base for those employees?
So that it was, I'm kind of looking across at Jenny, and it was a long process, and you're exactly right. One of the things that we always say is, if you're kind of going to survey staff, you're going to collect data, start off with a hypothesis, and you almost want to collect data to disprove that, right? That's the scientific method. It's not gathering data to prove you're right. That's not the scientific method. The scientific method is going, I think this, is there any evidence that something different is the case. And that's the way to really give you insight. So we had a nice closed loop process in talking with Jenny. We kind of had a context of, based on other data, what we thought was the case. Went in with a question set around that, and actually were able to show that some of the things we thought were actually a little bit different were not the case. But then kind of coming back around the loop. So we actually went back to the organizations and talked to them about the data we got out so that you can contextualize it. So again, it's that kind of go into the research with an idea, go in with a view of show me I'm wrong rather than show me I'm right, because you can always find a way to prove you're right. And then qualify that with face-to-face discussions to check, have I got the right end of what the data is telling me here?
I love that approach of going in with the hypothesis of trying to prove yourself wrong. I think that would be a challenge for a lot of communicators, because we don't like to be proven wrong, but I like that discipline and approach to it.
Yeah, I think the other thing for me is that this is where the combination of the comms and the data works really well in the partnership with Benjamin, because there's a lot of stuff where I'll be coming up with lots of different ideas and he'll help me shape that into using language and question sets that help us get the right answers. And it helped us narrow the scope. And we had the sort of the 3 buckets. So the way the questions were designed allowed us to cross-tabulate them, if you like. So we had the organisation news, the industry news, and the sort of team news, so that you could look at the different content buckets and you could map that across channels and different places. And I think having the time to have the detailed conversations we were having about, right, how do we get underneath this data properly is the bit that's really helpful up front.
And Ginny, I don't want to give away the whole report. We'll give people instructions on how they can go download the full report. But for you, with your experience in comms, what are, let's say, 3 highlights or possibly even head scratchers that you uncovered in this research?
So I think there were definitely 3, 4 or 5 things that we uncovered that were not always surprising, but were just a little bit disappointing, I think. And that's because of where we are as a profession. So we don't get into the detail enough of the demographic of the people that are inside our organizations. So one of the things that surprised us was the ability we had to break down the workers into either a solitary worker, a mixed worker, or a team worker. And that's because when you look at the remote workers, they're doing different tasks. So a solitary worker would be a bus driver. So when we were talking to the bus drivers, it became very clear that actually they don't need each other to complete their tasks. They go and drive a bus, they come back and they eat food and have a laugh, and then they go out and drive their bus. So we would class them as a solitary worker based on the way their conversations are much more social. They don't really talk much about work. So quite different. Then you've got your mixed workforce, which people that work in a cafe or a restaurant where they rely on each other, but their conversations are predominantly work or task based. So the waitress relies on the chef, relies on the bartender, and they sort of work in a sort of mixed environment. Then you've got your team, which is your sort of fire service, where they are a true team. I know we use the word team a lot, but they are a true team because you're relying on different skills to save somebody. And their communication and the way they work together is very different. And I don't think we've looked at them in those buckets before now. And I don't think we spend the time looking into that level of detail into the demographics inside our organizations. And that was just really insightful to look at the content and the way they communicate and the space and time for them with that one. The other one for me was probably around the importance of line managers. And again, this came up as a barrier in the Gatehouse report to successful communication. And we've often talked about line managers being a challenge to successful internal communication. But this report highlighted really that you can do lots of other work as an internal communicator, and you can spend hours doing all different sorts of channels and everything. But if you haven't trained your line managers to be good communicators, then all of that is for nothing. And I hadn't realised just how much impact that has on the people that are working in those teams remotely.
And Jenny, going back to Benjamin's point about having a hypothesis and trying to disprove it, did you disprove yours in the process of this research, or what was your hypothesis coming in?
I think the line manager piece was a big one for me. Was how important are they really? Is this something that we say a lot of the time, but is it something that we're pretending is an issue, or is it really a problem? And I think uncovering just how important that is, and what we say whenever we share the research and the sessions we've done is stop doing anything else. Stop doing the investment in digital channels and spend time training your line managers on how to be better communicators, because it will pay back hugely for what you need to achieve. And I think that it's proved their importance, but it's proved their importance like tenfold for me.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of interesting data that you guys uncover, but there were two data points that stuck out to me, and kind of rounding here a little bit, but it's roughly a third of remote workers believe their manager is an accurate source of information. So that was something that came out, which is what you just confirmed. So only a third think they're accurate, but managers are viewed as the most informative and most accurate channel. So what does that say about all the other channels and all the other efforts from communicators around accuracy and trust? And when only a third believe their manager is accurate, but that's the most informative, accurate channel.
We're all doomed. So this is the channels piece is really interesting, because again, in the data, you can see that the way we structured the questions was so that you could look at your channels against your content. So we can see which channels are used more for organizational news, which channels are used more for team, which channels are used more for industry. So you can start to see where the face-to-face comes in and where digital is playing a role and where we're maybe getting that a little bit wrong. But with the channels, it's very clear in the data that it doesn't matter really which channel you use, as long as you do it really, really well. So there isn't one channel that you can say, this is the channel that everyone should have. You're actually better off to say, I'm going to focus on doing a print magazine, and we're going to do it really, really well. And we're going to invest in getting it into people's homes, and we're going to invest in getting journalists to help us write it, and we're going to invest in the design and all those things. And we're going to make it amazing. You will get a better return for that than you would do trying to have lots of different channels doing lots of different things. And I think that was quite surprising around the channels, because I think we focus a lot on having lots of channels sometimes, whereas actually you should have one or two. Mm-hmm. The accuracy piece is really interesting, and we used accuracy to really talk to us about trust. And I think, and Benjamin may want to step in here, but I think the trusted piece was just really insightful, especially when you link it back to the Edelman Trust Report and where that trust sits in organizations, because previously we thought it would be in the colleagues, and actually that wasn't found to be the most trusted. And I'm not entirely sure people trust a lot of things inside organizations, which is a bigger problem. And a lot of the places we went to were heavily unionized, and I think that's had somewhat of an impact on there as well.
Yeah, and there's I have a phrase which is good is a low bar, in that a lot of the time what we saw is people try and do lots of things. But actually doing one thing well is better, and getting to good is not a very high bar. It's kind of one side. The other side is you really kind of have to aim for something above that to get there. There's just kind of so much going off for these folks that you really need to focus down on understanding them and getting them the right things. And if you do that, you can make a spectacular difference as a communicator.
Yeah, and Benjamin, I think this is a bit of a complaint from communicators, but they often say, our employees tell us they get way too much information and they've got information overload. But in your research, at least from the remote worker standpoint, very few, I think it was like 3%, said information overload is a problem. So my question to you, Benjamin, are we bringing in too much of our own bias here around information overload and projecting our own workload onto them, where they're saying, no, we're not getting enough information?
So there's two things kind of behind that which are really interesting and kind of came out in the data. One is that, and it's kind of obvious when you say it after the fact, but people don't think about this going in, that feeling of information overload, that feeling of I get too much information, that is what we call an attitudinal measure, right? That's an opinion, right? That's not that saying, how many emails did you get this week? Was it 10, 20, 50, 100, right? That's a kind of, an objective measurement. How you feel about, did I get too much stuff? That's a subjective opinion. It's a really important one, but the thing about it being a subjective opinion is it's very contextual. So two things. One, how you ask that question is going to give you different answers, right? Hey, I saw you got 500 emails last week. Do you get too much information? Yeah, I've got information overload. So you have to be careful how you frame the question. But the other thing that was kind of key that we saw in the data is the issue of relevance. If I send you 10 emails that are completely irrelevant and one that's useful, versus I send you 50 emails that are all useful and relevant. And then I ask you, do you get too much information? The person doesn't say, I get too much information, is the one who got 10 emails, not the one who got 50. Because your sense of whether I'm getting too much information is driven by, one, is the stuff I'm getting useful? But also, interestingly, what do I think other people are getting? And particularly in these environments where people are more cut off, if you feel like you're getting less information than other people, you're going to feel like you're not getting enough. So there's a lot of different factors that play into that piece that comes into kind of information overload, relevance being the absolute key one, because otherwise you leave people feeling overwhelmed by what's in there. And it's not to do with the quantity of stuff, it's to do with the quality of it and the channels it's coming to them from.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge of a lot of communicators who have kind of subscribed to the spray and pray approach to communications I talk about. You just throw it all out there and pray somebody cares about it. That's a great way to think about it, Benjamin. It is about what are they getting, how are they getting it, and does it matter to them? And if you're getting a lot of information that doesn't matter to you, that is too much. But if everything you get is important to you in your day-to-day job or is interesting to you, then that's exactly what you want to get. So you're right. Probably how you ask that question is going to deliver the answers. But I liked, at least from the standpoint of this, that these employees, these remote workers, if you guys have described them, are probably in many companies starving for content. They're not getting enough. They're having to rely on their manager for probably everything, or at least a lot of things. And communicators need to get creative with how they're increasing that relevancy and personalization to that employee base.
And relevance there, most importantly, it's not whether you think it's relevant as a communicator, it's whether they think it's relevant as the receiver of that. And again, it sounds like a really obvious thing, and it's back to know your audience, but it is really important to understand what is important to them, what do they need, and understand how that varies in the different groups in your organization, because there's a huge amount of variance. And again, especially for these remote workers, they are so time scarce. If your job is kind of flat out, to stop and receive some communication, if they're giving you their attention, that's incredibly precious, and you really got to use that window well with the right communications.
That's great, Benjamin. And a final question for you, Jenny. I love this topic of the third space that you brought into this research. So explain to listeners what this is, what third space is, and what you found out about it.
So third space is a term coined by Ray Oldenburg, who's a sociologist, and it's really to identify the space that's between home and work. And people like Starbucks have used this in their branding work to encourage people to create a space that's neither one or the other. But that space is a very protected space and a space that's your own. So in the workplace, especially for the deskless remote workers, this is their canteen, their space where they're interacting with their colleagues in a more sort of social space. And what we tend to do as communicators is think, this is great. We've got everybody together in a room. Let's chuck some great big screens in there and put loads of messages on there. And what happens is people either turn off the screens or switch over to a different channel. We heard stories of people plugging in PlayStations or Xboxes to the screens and just doing stuff for their own use. And part of that is because we are in putting the screens in spaces like that, we're invading their third space. So it's like you being in Starbucks having a coffee and somebody coming in and saying, you haven't put the washing on, or you haven't put dinner out, or you haven't been to the shops, and where's your email that you meant to send me last week? It's a bit like, this is neither of those spaces. This is my time. And the screens are just too intrusive for them in that space. So you can put things in there. So we found that if you're using the third space as part of your place to communicate, things like notice boards go down really well because people can choose whether to go and look at those. But the digital screens was the one that for everybody came up again and again as just being far too intrusive, and no matter where you put it as well, if you're entering that space for them, that's not what they're there to do. They're not there to do their work. They're there to either socially interact with colleagues or just chill out and have some food.
So in my case, Jenny, work is home and home is work. So can I designate my couch? And if I'm watching a football game, can I go to my kids and say, this is my third space, stay out of it?
I totally think you should.
I think it's great research, Jenny. So why don't you tell people where they can go and download the full report?
So there's a website called remotelyinterested.work. and there's the key themes on there, and you can also download a full copy of the report as well.
Jenny and Benjamin, I want to thank you both for coming on Ecology to talk about your research and around remote workers and employee communication. I think there's sometimes some groupthink and echo chamber action that happens in this topic. So I love any creative research around here. And we'll share something with both of you. Your research in this topic has spurred me to think about research in another topic related to this particular audience. So thank you for kind of spurring that and scratching that itch for me.
Good. The more research, the better, I say. So great, go for it.
Absolutely.
And please follow Ecology on Twitter @LearnEcology to pick up show announcements as well as other IC news. And if you're not already a subscriber, listen to Ecology on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If internal communications is your passion, Ecology is your podcast. Thanks for listening in.